least in this setting. Outside of this setting, my most important credential is for my family. So investing in the real-time web, let's just kind of get started, and hope that there are shout-outs later on in the second half. This is a 20-minute session, so in the second half, feel free to start with shout-outs. But in the beginning, we'll give everybody a chance to talk. So there are two central questions, and I'll throw them both out and answer them in the order of the table. So one question, which is more Jeff's question, give credit to Jeff, but I think it's a good question. The next one is more mine. So the first one is, do you guys see a lag in the real-time web when you cross the ocean to here? Are we operating in sync with the rest of the world, or are we in a semi-real-time web? Are we sort of behind the rest of the world? Or are we in advance of the rest of the world? Those are your options. Second question is, as investors, much more importantly, I think people here want to hear from an investment point of view. How many people here, just to get a sense of the audience, how many people here are in a startup or are thinking of starting a company? Okay. How many people here would like more money? You weren't supposed to answer that. You have money to give away.
That just means you to invest, right?
Okay. How many people here at Bob actually make money? Bob can raise his money. So, and just you can each give a 10-second introduction.
140 characters.
Yeah. So the second central question is usage versus business. What's more important when you're investing, or Bob, in your case, both investing internally and maybe externally? What's more important? Is it to generate incredible amount of usage, or do you need to understand from the get-go how this is going to make money? So usage versus business model. And let's get started. Adam.
Which question? First one? Second one?
Any order you want.
All right. So
if you fail to answer, I'll push you.
When it comes to social media, I think by definition we lag only because, at least we lag right now, as do most countries outside of the U.S., because most of the new platforms and forms of communication are coming out of the U.S. But that's not always the case. It doesn't always have to remain that way. There were new services such as Skype, which did not originate in the U.S., where at least when Bessemer invested in its A round, they were mostly what you would call kind of migrant users, people who were using Skype may have been in the U.S., but they often were English speakers and they were communicating internationally. And of course, at the time, nobody said, well, is Israel lagging the U.S. in Skype? It was completely the opposite. I heard about Skype at the time from startup companies in Israel who didn't really want to pay the phone bill. So I think maybe what Jeff was referring to was more Facebook and Twitter, kind of the current generation of social media. I think right now there's a lag, but I think it can easily be closed. I think both platforms are open to multiple to different languages, and I think culturally speaking, it's very suitable for Israel. So I think that Israel will reach there in no time, and I think that the idea of the lag really won't be a major issue. As long as I'm speaking usage versus business model, this is actually a tough one. I think in general, if you're an entrepreneur, you have to decide whether your idea at its root is a brilliant business idea, or if it's really kind of a brilliant product concept. Since most startups in the social media space are more about product, you naturally have to focus on usage because anything else will confuse you. And as an investor, we look at things and we say, well, it could be successful. Everybody in the world could want to use that, but how would we know? And we don't. And I think there may be some investors who claim to be smarter, but the reality is we don't know until you see traction, until you see momentum, until it stays over time. Time is also an aspect. To see a couple months of amazing usage, that sometimes isn't enough either. At the same time, now that you have really interesting platforms, open platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and others, there are social media companies where their entire goal is actually not so much usage, rather, we are going to be the first to actually make money off these platforms. And that's also interesting and legitimate. And of course, there, you want to focus initially on some level of traction of usage, but at the end of the day, what you're presenting to investors, most likely, is a really smart business opportunity. And of course, if that's the case, then we want to really understand how. Does it have, what kind of longevity does it have? Is it something that others can do really easily? How do you maintain some kind of a barrier to entry? So we see room for both. But by and large, if you're a social media company, you need to show traction, you get a product out there and start moving.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Thank you. I'm Danny Cohen. I'm a partner at Gemini Israel Funds, and we invest in Israeli companies, and we currently invest. The question, so Adam's a great man, and everything he does is great, but I disagree with him. And I think there's no bad. I actually think in some ways we're right at the edge or even beyond that, and I'll say a couple examples. I think, I remember for me, one of the first, and it's not a good example, I'm sorry, but when Elon's son died of a plane, and if you were on Twitter that day, it was just amazing to see what was happening, because the whole, the device was just going wild, right? Everybody was like, did you hear? There's something going on, and you can kind of see it at the edge of how things are happening. I think when we look at the U.S., we get confused sometimes, because I know it's true about us, we get the Silicon Valley view, and the Silicon Valley view is very much, that's where everything happens. And then, I'm not sure if you compare mainstream Israel to mainstream Midwest America, are we lagging or not? I would say we're not. I think I doubt if you drive in the main street of Salt Lake City, you would see a campaign by Procter & Gamble talking about, be friends on Facebook. We see that right here in Israel. So overall, I feel that we're getting there, or we're there. The question is, how does that translate to business opportunities and great startups? I think it's a tough one, and I don't know how to answer that.
Well, as an investor, and you spend a lot of time in the States also, do you see a lag in the amount of startups in the area?
No, the amount, I think the amount is not. The big challenge for us in Israel is that our market is different by definition. And a lot of Israeli companies, when they want to go to target a market, a U.S. market, they don't have a good feel of what the mainstream American consumer wants. And without that, and without spending time in those markets, I think there's a challenge. And what happens a lot of times, and it's hard to say the right word, but we're kind of a bit off. We get 80% of what we need, but we're not 100% there. And getting that 100% requires to be out there in the field. And I can give one example. I think they're here today, and we invest in a company called Sense of Fashion. I think Mario is actually speaking today. That's for them, not for me, right? And if you look what they're doing, is they're already spending and putting a lot of resources and time in the U.S. market. As much as you read about it, if you're not there, that doesn't work. Finally, I will say that I agree with, if you look at usage versus business models, I will say that you need both. But we will not invest in, we'll have a great amount of users and then figure out the business model. We won't do that. I think that that could work only at a scale of Facebook. I don't think it would work for an Israeli startup. But of course,
an Israeli startup could become Facebook.
No.
Interesting, but we'll get to that.
Can I say one more thing on, and he's probably right, I was probably wrong.
The panel is over, thank you so much.
Wow, we haven't even finished the panel.
No, he's right in the sense that it's really hard to measure these things. Measure lag or not. I don't want to make a judgment on that. But what I will say is that when you think about social media in Israeli culture, there are two things that we should remember which make it much more suitable for Israeli culture. The first is that Israelis could care less about privacy. in contrast to Americans. And the second thing is that you can say a hell of a lot more in 140 characters in Hebrew than you can in English. So,
I didn't want to get that out. Bob, I want to preempt you just a little bit, based on something that Danny just said. Something that
He has the answers.
Wait, I'm going to get to it. I know he has the answers. But do you physically need to be there? You're running a company sitting in Jerusalem. On the other hand, you travel a lot. To know what's going on in the world, right, in a real-time way, you need to physically, and Jeff, you could speak to this as well, do you need to physically be in the world, or can you sit in Jerusalem and actually not have any land, and yet you can be cutting edge in the real-time way?
Good question. By the way, I hope we can get to hear Jacob's answers to these also. My name is Bob Rosenschein. I'm the founder and CEO of Answers.com. Answers.com we're a top 25 website in the U.S., top 35 worldwide. We have something like 50 million unique visitors every month. We just passed the Weather Channel and Craigslist. We're catching up to the New York Times. So in a way, we're one of the largest, if not the largest, Israeli site. The answer to your question is very simple. Ken Valo. It's very important to be there just to talk to people. There's no substitute for face-to-face meetings and getting to know people. However, Israel's still a great place to do a startup, great place to do R&D. Israel has such a big advantage. We wake up 7 hours before the Americans. And we stay up late. So there's no limits. I think the obvious things that have been mentioned here before about culture, the level of Israeli chutzpah. To answer your question very briefly about whether you have to have a business model at what stage, it depends on your financial condition. If you can run on a shoestring, then I think going the product way has a lot of advantages. Because sometimes products develop. Foursquare might not have been obvious what they wanted to do with it. It might not be obvious to them now what they want to do with it, but having the freedom to develop concepts also helps. If you're going to start an enterprise software company, you don't have a business model defined well in advance, it's problematic. But I think Israel's a great place to do it. I think the speed of being able to develop quickly and invest quickly are the key. And there's nothing that the Israeli population also has another advantage. I read a number of years ago that the average number of minutes in a telephone conversation, I'm making this up a little bit, I think it was something like 2.3 minutes was the average length of an American telephone conversation. And in Israel, for some reason, it was 6.5 minutes.
Is that based on anything, or did you literally just make all of that?
I actually read that, but I just don't remember the exact number. It was significantly higher in Israel because, I don't want to get into the Jewish culture, but it's certainly a, Israelis are more communicative, sort of highly communicative. So there's probably an advantage there. Don't have to go to instant messaging and other technologies. We're building a system that we want to give you the very best answers to anything. Okay, we have a crowdsourced component, we have an editorial component, but our goal is to get people good information. And the ability to tie into that flow in real time is very important for us. We are investing internally in real time. We are, I don't want to say investing in other companies so much, but if you have a hot startup that you're interested in partnering or more, my email is bob@answers.com. But don't send me a business plan. Send me a 140 character.
Let me push Dan. Yeah, but I want to push you a little bit as well, then you can ask some questions. We can do it at the same time. So Danny said, no, there won't be a Facebook-size company to come out of Israel. I understood you right. Correct me.
Absolutely. And Google. Won't be a Google.
So just give us another 30 seconds on that. Why not? Because you have a bunch of people in the room. How many people agree with Danny that there won't be a Facebook or a Google to come out of Israel? How many people?
Come on.
Unlikely, or
And
I'll give you $5 if you raise your hand down. Come on.
How many people disagree? How many people disagree? How many people haven't been paying attention? Okay.
Look, I think here's my reality. I think there are companies at the top 5 in the world, right? There are Microsoft, there are Google, Facebook. I think is getting there. I think the chances for Israel to scale to that level, there's so many limitations on the people you can hire, on your ability to understand markets. I mean, the whole notion of scale in this country is difficult. We're a small country, it's hard. I think we haven't proven at all our ability to scale at that level. Even our greatest companies, and they're phenomenal, Checkpoint and Converse, they're great companies, but they will never get to that top 5%. And I think shooting for that, I think is just being unrealistic. Right?
You had a question for Bob, and I want to know if you agree with me.
There's a difference between impossible and highly unlikely. It's not that likely.
Okay. Well, what was your question for Bob?
How long have you been running the company?
11 years, 6 months, and 2 days.
So who's counting?
The great, see,
I have no white hair.
they're great entrepreneurs in Israel. I think and they stick to it for a long time. And they make great things out of it. So we have great qualities here.
There were moments of doubt. Enough. Not enough.
So just want to turn to Jeff for 1 second, and then I'll try and back up a little bit. Jeff, you sensed the dissonance or a lag. Why? Where did that come from? Did you mean more from adoption, more from startups?
Well, certainly the distance in terms of the lag in terms of usage or even adoption of, say, Twitter. Well, if you look at the penetration and such, and then when I come to Tel Aviv, I usually sit down with startups and get pitched on stuff as far as where ideas are going. And the last time I sat down 2 months ago, 5 people wanted to be Foursquare. But by and large, though, it seemed to be less thinking about the real-time web and the impact of it and what the derivatives would be. And I think that in other areas, whether it's in communications or in security, Israel's led the world. And that if you look for Israeli innovation and impact of Israel on the internet, I don't think there's another country in the world really that's had the impact that Israel's had and will continue to have. But when you look at social communications, I just found it ironic that there seems to be a lag in terms of local adaptability of the platforms, and then the innovation on top of that as far as affecting change and pushing that particular field forward. I mean, I happen to be in a minority, but I'm now an investor in Foursquare as of last week, and I was pretty happy to see they had 1 million check-ins a couple of days ago. And whether it's a phenomenon or not that's going to disappear, I don't think so. I think for 10 years, location-based services have been interesting to equipment vendors and to service providers. But the fact that it took a bottom-up movement by the people to actually affect change, that was the cool part. And I think that here in Israel, there's so many great things that are happening on the ground level that turn into companies, that turn into movements. And so, but I just was not seeing it or feeling it at the level I expected, I suppose.
I was going to say, one of the things that strikes me in terms of the difference between the U.S. and Israeli startups is that a lot of the things we see here, especially on the internet side, are often I wouldn't call them copycats. In fact, very little that, but much more trying to emulate or innovate on something that somebody else has already done. And then there's room for that. Lots of great companies are built that way, and sometimes it is kind of a better mousetrap, quote unquote. But what you really need to build a large company in the internet space in Israel, or any country for that matter, is that kind of spark of creativity and innovation that actually has no precedent. Not something that's going to be similar to Twitter, but something that really comes out of left field, as we say. And that's where I encourage entrepreneurs to think. Just think completely out of the box. It's actually much harder than it sounds. But I think when that starts happening more and more, and you realize that you don't have to look or feel like something else has already been successful, that's when the sparks will fly and something big can be created.
Although Metacafe started before YouTube, and I think that shows something about getting it right or not. And I think there's sparks here, just getting the sparks to be right on. Because we had that opportunity, they, in this, we didn't. Sorry.
Well, sometimes we forget there are actually a country of 7 million people, although we like to talk a lot. We actually are a smaller country. I'll reserve the last 5 seconds for myself. I think Facebook could come out of, the next Facebook could come out of Israel. I think we have an inferiority complex sometimes. I don't think the VC model or investment model is broken. I think there is a break in the entrepreneurial cycle. Sometimes we copycat too much, and we look what's happening in the world, and we want to just validate what we're doing, what's going on there, rather than really being out of the box thinking of completely new things, really innovative. I think we need to go there more as an entrepreneurial community. And then lastly, I want to say I think Bob's a great example where you can actually physically base your company in Israel and be cutting edge and be really a global brand and a global reach. And sometimes we miss that as well. How much do we physically need to be in the world? Well, for the sake of those people who have families, I think we should have to hope and pray it's less and less. And we need to physically be in the world. I would agree. Unfortunately, I would agree. Although it's nice to see friends in person, that you do need to get out there. You do need to be at the conferences, at least a couple in a year. That is important. And I thank everybody for listening to it.